So let's continue where we left off on verse 9. Now, remember, leadership always rises to the top, above all adversity. However, the church will never rise above its leadership. Listen to me carefully. The church can never rise above its leaders. If you are a leader and you're mediocre, you're half-stepping, okay? You haven't prepared yourself to lead, and this is where you're functioning at this level. This is where you are. This is where your church is going to be, down here, okay? And you're crying and you're complaining and you're belly aching about your church is this, your church is not this, your church is not that. I always look toward the leadership, because that's where the problem is. If you are mediocre and you're weak, your church is going to be mediocre and weak. See, you are following the church instead of the church following you. Buddy, you better make a decision here. You know, lead or get out. Make a decision. I understand church politics. I understand denominational politics. Okay? I understand all that nonsense. It's not biblical, because you got caught up in the world of church interpretation instead of biblical interpretation. So let's go back here. I just described the conditions that Paul finds himself. He's at the bottom of this ship, and he's warning them. He's giving them counsel. Verse 9, Acts chapter 27, right, is what we're reading here. When considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them. And he said to them, "Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo in the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. When a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchored and began sailing along Crete all close inshore. But before long, there rushed down from the land a violent wind called Urakilo. And when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. So the ship just couldn't resist this. Running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After they had hoisted it up and used supporting cables in undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be driven along. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. They're dumping the cargo now. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Since neither the sun nor the stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on, all hope of being saved was gradually abandoned. I mean, they're facing all kinds of problems. Now, you remember what Paul said to them back in verse 10, right? I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. And basically, they ignored them. Shut up. Stay down there in the hole where you are. Look down at verse 21. And when they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice, and not to have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. Yet now I urge you to keep on your courage, to keep up your courage, for there will be no more loss of life among you, but only of the ship." Now, again, he's giving them counsel. "For this very night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood before me. saying, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe that I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island." And when the 14th night came, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and a little farther out, they took another sounding, and they found it to be 15 fathoms. So a sounding is that they would drop this rope, okay, and it would have a weight on it, okay, and as soon as they touched the ground, then they would measure how deep the water was. So at one point here, you could see here, according to verse 28, they were at 20 fathoms, then they went down to 15 fathoms, okay? So they understood they were getting closer and closer to land. But as the sailors were trying to escape in go to verse 29. Fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. So they bring this boat to a halt, okay? And they want now the daytime to come, because this is at night, okay? Because they're not certain what's going to happen. But look at this, verse 30. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and let down the ship's boat into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow. So they go, "Oh yeah, we're going to put out these anchors." No, they're looking to get off of this ship. They're afraid. They're going to abandon the ship. Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, look what he says, Paul, again, "Unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved." The wisdom of Paul is incredible. He understood their selfishness. He understood their desire to persevere and to be preserved. So Paul appeals to that, and look what he does. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. This way, the ship, all of the other men on the ship could not escape. Until the day was about dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore, I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation. For not a hair from the head of any of you will perish." So he's telling them, you're not going to die. Remember, the angel of the Lord talked to me. Having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. All of them were encouraged. Listen, they were first scared of death, and it says here in verse 37 and verse 36, and all of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. All of us in the ship were 276 persons. So there's 276 men on this ship. And when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. When they came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they let them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders and hoisting to foresail the wind. They were heading for the beach. I mean, have you ever wondered why, you're a Christian, you're sitting here and you're reading, why am I supposed to know why am I supposed to know so much about a ship? What do I care about a ship? I'm never going to sail. I'm not going to be a sailor. Why do I need to? But you get lost in the details because you don't understand the purpose for the details. Verse 41. But striking a reef where two seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. Now in verse 42, the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. That was the plan. But the centurion wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intentions, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they were all brought safely to land. Not one man lost his life. Exactly how Paul had told him. Now Paul's in custody. He's chained. He's leading this group. He's in the bottom deck. So at this point in the narrative, in this story of the book of Acts, shifts gears. Now we have a complete shifting taking place here. Luke begins writing in the first person, suggesting that he was permitted to go along as Paul's companion on the journey to Rome. And that's where we get this idea from. So he writes his own first-hand testimony, an inspired eyewitness chronicle, an eyewitness account. And he begins to color in more details. In fact, this chapter of Acts is set by other first century, by some scholars, to contain more information about ancient seafaring than virtually any other first century source that ever existed before. And amazingly, there are more words in Scripture devoted to detailing Paul's journey from Caesarea to Rome than all the words about the creation in Genesis. Wow. So it is an important account. Why? Because what we're going to see here is an unpacking of Paul's leadership. When the journey to Rome began, Paul was clearly the low man on the totem pole. He had no authority, he had no responsibility, and he had no rights. You hear me? He had no authority, he had no responsibilities, and he had no rights. And as a prisoner, he was at the bottom both physically and socially. Now, I've spent some time ministering in prisons. Let me tell you something. I have visited a prison where some well-known men were incarcerated. One of them used to be the president of one of the largest life insurance companies in America. Another was a famous building contractor who had earned millions before losing it all in some kind of a fraud scandal. And there were several formidable people in that prison, people who were accustomed, and they were all accustomed to power, men who knew what it was to wield authority. Mixed in with them was the unusual assortment of drug dealers, neo-Nazi members of the Aryan Brotherhood, and various street criminals. You name it, they got them all. Right? And let me tell you something. I can remember being in prison in South Africa when Nelson Mandela was held a prisoner. I went to that prison to minister. It is just beyond description of what you see in there. But you know what I noticed? In this prison that I went to, no one had a daytimer. None of them had cell phones. None of them had secretaries. None of them had any pinstripe suits on. None of them had silk ties on. They had been stripped. They had been stripped of all of their accoutrements, okay, of power. Anything that represented power, they was just taken completely away from them. They were told when to go, when to get up, when to eat, when to exercise, when to work in the laundry. No one had any authority whatsoever. What they were, they no longer were. In fact, I had taken the Bible to give a certain inmate. I had taken his Bible, but I was told he wasn't allowed to have it. The only way I can get it to him was through a designated prison chaplain. And the chaplain first was required to tear off the book's front and back covers so that the prisoner could use the hardcover as boards to make weapons. So, and it had to be a hardcover Bible. And then they had to rip off the hardcovers because they were turned into a weapon. See, prisoners have absolutely no authority. None. Zero. And that was Paul's situation. Zero authority. Undoubtedly, the ship he was to sail on was selected by him by the Roman officials. He was placed in the company of a man named Julius, whom Luke says was a centurion of the Augustinian regiment, the imperial cohort. Okay? I want you to understand that. Because it says in Acts 27, verse 1, and when it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to the centurion Augustine, a cohort named Julius. And this is Julius Caesar's personal imperial cohort guard. That's who's taking him back to Rome. As a centurion, Julius had 100 men under his command, and they were specifically assigned to work for Caesar. So as centurions goes, he was one of the highest ranking in the entire Roman army, and his men would have been elite soldiers. This is the company that Paul has been placed under. By the way, here's an interesting footnote. Every time you encounter a Roman centurion in Scripture, you find a man, and this is it, this is going to be true. You will find a man of integrity. He is highly respectable, highly intelligent. He is a virtuous man. The Romans were not very good at selecting governors, that's for sure. But apparently they had some means of choosing their centurions that weeded out the weak and the incompetent ones. We meet centurions in Matthew chapter 8. We meet them also in Luke chapter 7. We meet them in Mark chapter 15. We see them in Acts chapter 10. We see them in Acts chapter 22. And we see them in Acts chapter 24. And all of them are upright men of decency and honor. Julius is no exception to the rule. Julius Augustine. Luke wrote this in Acts chapter 27, verse 2. And embarking in the Adramyttian ship, which is about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, look what it says. We put out to sea accompanied by our Aristarchus and a Macedonian of Thessalonica. So we put out to sea. Now, the verse concludes here that Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. Aristarchus was a friend and a companion of Luke and Paul. That's who this man is. Okay? He is mentioned here in Acts chapter 20, also in verse 4. You find him there. He says, and he was accompanied by Sopater of Berea and son of Pyrrhus, okay? And by Aristarchus and Secundus of the Thessalonians, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy and Tychicus and Trophimus of Asia. So this is a man, Aristarchus. He was a friend. He's a companion of Luke and Paul. He's mentioned, as I just read here in Acts chapter 20, verse 4, as one of the several members of the Thessalonian church who accompanied Paul home to Jerusalem after his third missionary journey. Okay? Now, according to Acts, if you go to Acts chapter 19 now, in verse 29, okay, Aristarchus was also with Paul in Ephesus when that whole city rioted in preaching, and they rioted, okay, at the preaching of the gospel. He was with them also there. Look at this in Acts chapter 19, verse 29. I want to establish for you who all these characters. I mean, you read them and you read the names. You go, who's this and who's that and who's this and who's that? Why is he important? But why is he mentioned? Well, I'm trying to explain to you, and it all fits into this storyline, into this narrative. Now, in Acts chapter 19 and verse 29, the city was filled with confusion, and they rushed with one accord to the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. And so he had been a long-time friend and a companion of Paul's, so no doubt he was a believer and a fellow minister of the Lord Jesus Christ. He had apparently stayed with Paul through those years of imprisonment in Caesarea. Now there's a friend. Now he would accompany Paul and Luke on their trip to Rome. That sets the scene. This is what's happening here. Paul is a prisoner. The ship would have a captain and probably a first mate. Under them would be other ranking sailors. Okay? Overseeing Paul's custody was a Roman centurion. I mean, we could see that. Go back to Acts chapter 27. And look what it says in verse 31 and 32. Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. Remember that advice that he had given them? So, overseeing Paul's custody was a Roman centurion, and he said some of his soldiers were with him. Crack troops. These were the elite troops. So there was a lot of people with authority on that ship. I mean, everybody and their mother in this ship has got authority of some kind, except who? Paul. And obviously, Aristarchus didn't have any authority. Luke did not have any authority, much less Paul. He didn't have any, right? Not Paul. He was at the bottom of everything, literally. Perhaps even in the literal sense. This is where he was. He would not have been kept no doubt he would have been kept in the hold of the ship. This is where he went. And yet Paul, from this position, it's from this position that Paul, okay, begins to manifest all of his leadership. Now we go back to Acts 27 and in verse 3, because I want you to see this. But Julius seems to have been a nobleman. We know that, right? And Augustine, right? He was the centurion, okay? Because it says that just after 1 day's travel during the first stop in Sidon, on the first day of the trip, some 70 miles north of the Mediterranean coast from Caesarea, this is what he said to them. It says, the next day we put out to Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go with his friends and receive care. Now, this man was a man of integrity, this centurion. I know that, the kind of picture that we get of the Roman soldiers, that they were all mean, ugly, and blah, 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 blah. No, they were carrying out their duties. But the centurion were men of integrity. And somehow, he granted trust into the life of Paul. He trusted Paul, because if Paul hadn't returned, he would have gone into the city, okay, and just killed everybody. So so he received care. Paul had been in prison for 2 years. Remember that he's been in prison for 2 years before he gets on this ship to go to another prison, right? So this expression translated here at the end of verse 27, and receive care, is a medical term. It's actually a medical term. Okay? It indicates that the apostle was probably suffering from some kind of ailment. We're not told what it was that he was suffering from. We're told that he did suffer something. Okay? That isn't any wonder, okay, since he had been a prisoner for so long. And of course, Luke was a physician. We know that because in the book of Colossians, it says this in chapter 4, verse 14. Luke, the beloved physician, sends you his greetings and also Demas, okay? And so one of his duties, so one of the duties of Luke was obviously to take care of Paul. We know that, okay? So what I want you to see, I really, the problem is that we read the scriptures like we're reading a newspaper way too fast. Slow down. You need to savor the details so that you really get an understanding of the concepts that are being played out here in this narrative, okay, in which the Lord has chosen to share these details with us. He has a reason. There's a purpose for it. And we need to understand what those reasons are.